So in QuickSense, let me just find my screen so I can see the picture myself. So in QuickSense, there is the task where the user is asked to pick the illustration which most exemplifies what it is like to work in your organization. And we have picked six different pictures here, which have you would have different panes, different themes in them. The first one is basically, and I guess there will be some sort of overlay now, so you can actually see it. It's about two managers looking down at a group of people who, at a distance, look like they're hugging and high-fiving and cheering and pretty happy. And the managers conclude that yes, this agile initiative has worked and everybody's happy and it's a success. And then we zoom in the second picture, and they're not really hugging; they're fighting. And one is trying to get a gun free from the other one's hand, and they're not high-fiving; they're actually beating each other and so on, right? So actually, when we look at the details of the change that implementing agile ways of working really is for many, it's not going as successfully as we thought initially, right? So if this is the biggest pain in the organization, people will mark this picture. The next one is about a silo, a traditional silo, with corn or whatever you have in it, um, being broken down and painted white and as reassembled as a train, which is where there's a sign saying Agile Release Train, which we know from the SAFe methodology that it's a new way of organizing teams that are related to each other. So in this case, we're claiming to break down silos, but in reality, we're actually creating new ones just with more fancy names. So it's not a problem per se having silos, but the behavior within them, the way that the owner of the silo is measured could be competing with KPIs or measurements or whatever you have that are for the better of the whole organization, right? So the problem is if we break down silos and just use new fancy agile words to create new silos, we're actually making it even worse than it was before, right? And the third picture shows us basically this typical way of depicting Scrum is with the cycle, and then out of the cycle comes an increment every sprint, ideally. But in reality, what happens is that all of these increments are not really released, but they're added to huge uh, increments that are even bigger than the actual ideal small increments, and they're never really released because only once a year we can actually release this because it's all a project or a program surrounding our ways of working. So we're doing this fake agile Scrum stuff, but never really releasing and getting feedback, which is what we would like at least every sprint. But in reality, we don't do that. We do it when there is an official release and a gate has been passed and so on. So if that's the biggest challenge, they pick this picture. Then we have another one, which is basically a person looking at something that's not really, it's like looking really weird. You can see it in the picture. And it represents the target operating model that the company has bought from some sort of consultancy. It could, be any of the big four consultancies. Typically, what happens is that they have these PowerPoint slides, which are very expensive. They're like $500,000 per slide, and they have several of them. And it basically represents the way of working that you need to implement to be agile or to work in a specific way. But in reality, it's totally decoupled from your principles and ways of working in the organization and the culture as well, of course, since they don't really know your culture. And then you're left with a deck of slides with something that you can't really implement because they just pulled it out of somewhere. They always pull it out of, and it's the same as the other company got, but it's not really related to your ways of working in an organization and your context. And then you're left with that, and you spend more energy actually adjusting that to work in your context than making it, right? So if that's a challenge, that's the other picture. And then the fifth picture is about cognitive load, and particularly team cognitive load. We would like to have these stable, agile teams, but we don't want to overload them with all sorts of different contexts they need to switch between all the time. It's not necessarily a problem, but if nobody can really prioritize between these contexts, they need to work at all of them at the same time. And we see that happen many places with the root cause. If you can't even find a root cause, typically being that someone is not empowered to actually prioritize, right? Or there are too many conflicting goals in order to actually prioritize between contexts or deliveries or themes. And then the final one is more a role-specific one, which basically shows an architect sitting in an ivory tower. Which it could be whatever role. It could be a manager as well. It could even be an agile coach. But in this case, it's an architect sitting in the top of an ivory tower and making all sorts of drawings, while the teams who are doing the actual work are down on the ground by the grass doing actual work, where we depict there is a big discrepancy between what's happening in real life and what these architects are imagining the architecture to be like, right? So what we want rather is to have architects be part of the operational teams, the development teams, and you could say evolutionarily build the architecture rather than dreaming something up in the ivory tower. So these six different themes are a bit distinct, but also related to each other as well. And we ask the user to pick the ones that, yeah, resonates the most with them and which are most relevant for them right now. And yeah,
One of the things I love about these, by the way, I mean, my coding days are 30 years behind me now, all right? It's over 3 decades since I last cut code. What comes through in the cartoons is that you're in there and doing it. And you can see that real world experience being reflected in the cartoons. And I think that's one of the ways why they get bite. I think the other thing people need to be aware of is that you can, if you want, choose a different set of cartoons and put those in. Yeah, I mean, it'll cost you more money, but yes, you can do that. But also, I think the real opportunity is to move these things into bigger change programs. Once you can run a QuickSense, every month. You can run it every 3 months. You can get people to say we need to create more stories like these, fewer stories like those. You can measure whether you're moving in the right direction. But you can use the cartoons themselves as change agents in artifacts in your organization. And I think it's very different from, the sort of classic, what I call new age fluffy bunny, let's get everybody in a room and agree we'll be nice to each other, which doesn't really achieve change. I mean, we know from cognitive neuroscience, you need to create anomalies for people to think differently. Well, what cartoons do is they create an anomaly. Yeah, they make you think differently. And I think the role of artifacts is much neglected in change programs. By the way, something else which I think you mentioned earlier is the hybrid concept. I mean, that's what we said originally with Cynefin on XP. We didn't use the fancy word hybrid. We said different things in different contexts. But I think this also applies on the whole AI thing. So one of our other quick senses, for example, which is based on award-winning work that we did with AstraZeneca, is to look at AI preparedness and the balance between AI and human factors. Yeah, and that's a big issue in code at the moment. You've got, and I won't name names, you've got some really exaggerated claims being made for programmer productivity, which are all talking about speed of code development. None of them are talking about quality. Yeah, and I think that was an agile problem. It focused on speed, not quality. I mean, sometimes I remember working with Richard on this on pair programming. Sometimes you just need to let people do nothing for a few hours, not just produce code, right? So that's there. But I think the impact is key here. What we're giving you is a really fast, fun to use. It's not a survey. It's got cartoons. You tell stories. There's no Likert scales. You can't say anything negative really, which reduces the stress. That gives to give you a starting position. You can then measure whether your individual initiatives are starting to have an impact. You can say to people, well, what sort of balance will the pattern change with this initiative you're proposing, and then see if it achieves that. You can say, what sort of stories do you think you should have? And you can get people into making up stories, which there's nothing wrong about the future. Yeah. And saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could tell the story? So you can start to move into next steps very quickly, but you've got this constant backstop of monitoring whether you have an impact or not.